Hey everybody, welcome to part 2 of our study of depth of field, and of course we're going to get to the PgBokeh part, but for now I want to just kind of cover sensor size. There's a lot of confusion I noticed through filmmakers as well as VFX artists. How does sensor size affect depth of field? How does it affect the final image? And kind of dispelling some myths about sensor size and how cropping your actual cameras and so forth creates a different actual millimeter lens. It doesn't. The millimeter lens doesn't change, you're just cropping in on the image. So in the 3D view, again, you can get this file off of my main site with the link below from my online store. Just a simple nuke file, no biggie. So I got 2 cubes that have a texture on it in a scene, and I have 3 cameras sitting right on top of themselves in 3 different formats. So you can see the actual crop factor right there in that little size right there. So what we have is a full frame, commonly known for 5D Mark III, Sony A7S, Area Alexa 65, Red Weapon. Okay, that would be this full frame, this big one here. And then the next one down is this size right here, and that's APS-C or Super 35, commonly the Area Alexa 16:9, the Panasonic Vericam, or the Canon C500, you know, so forth. Also, I think C200 as well. And then you got the final small one, which would be in the category of the camera I've been shooting on recently, which is the Pocket Blackmagic 4K or Panasonic GH5 or the Red Raven. So very, very small little sensor size there. The Red Raven was like the affordable version of the Red, you know. So anyway, so here is just 2 cubes in the scene. I have a switch node to go through each one, and that switch node goes through the scanline render. Scanline render, if I just put my viewer to it, just renders out this. And then I have a simple Z defocus node, which adds some depth of field. All I did was change the little focal depth to here and change my size up to 16, max 23. That's all I did. So this is the basic depth of field. We're going to get into this, but I just want to show you guys the reality of this. So if I take the switch and go between the different frames here, the different cameras, we start with a full frame. We move to the APS-C, and we're going to go to the final crop factor, which is the micro four thirds. So again, depending on your budget, you can see in the computer realm, the computer doesn't register or understand the idea of the way that the larger the sensor size is, the more shallow depth of field. So in the computer, your depth of field is not going to change. But what's important to realize is we're simply just cropping in on an image. When you commonly have people say, well, I have a full frame camera, so, you know, a 50 millimeter is a 50 millimeter. Now, if I have an APS-C, I'm going to get a crop factor of 1.6, and that would be from here to here. And then if I have micro four thirds, it's going to be a crop factor of 2. So they commonly use terms like, well, if I have a 50 millimeter, it's going to equate to 100 millimeter at the sensors, eventually to the micro four thirds sensor size. That's not true at all. It's just a matter of the change of the depth of field, okay? It's changing your depth of field. It's not changing the physical characteristics of the lens. A 50 millimeter is a 50 millimeter is a 50 millimeter. So you can see the lens isn't changing. We're not getting more distortion like if we were to have a wide angle lens. It's not changing. It's just simply the sensor size is getting cropped. We're cropping in on the image. So just to give you the reality, if this was done in the real world, if we were doing this and changing up the sensor sizes, like we had a crazy camera that we could magically change the sensor size on, you would find that the depth of field would actually, the fall off in intensity would increase as you go from, you know, the smaller sensor sizes to the bigger sensor sizes. So at this realm, you could see that, you know, it's pretty much, you know, this is the depth of field difference. But in the real world, if you were to jump to APS-C, okay, I'm going to change it manually here, but I'm going to take it and I'm going to add a lot more depth of field. So I'll come over here and just up my size here. Okay, so now it's going to be even more, up to max here. So it's even crazier. Okay, and then if we go another step forward, again, we're talking about real world, not the computer. The computer can't figure this out. If I switch this over to my full frame, okay, so we're going to go to the full frame option here, unless we were already at the full frame. Let's see. I guess we were at the full frame. So again, if we were at APS-C, we would get this amount of depth of field fall off in intensity, and then if we're at full frame, where you can see more, obviously, If that's the case, then our depth of field would be even nuttier. It would be something like that. And again, I could take the focal plane here and adjust the focus here, probably to the foreground here. That's the kind of reality. So again, just to reiterate, on the full frame camera, you're going to get, because the sensor size is larger, you are going to get a change in the shallow depth of field intensity, as well as the fall off is going to be more intense. It's a lot harder to kind of grab focus because the field of view, or the actual depth of field, is always very hard. It's very more narrow, and people like that creamy, dreamy look where it's just very cinematic. It concentrates on your actor. So again, if we were to jump, I'm sorry for repeating this, but I'm going to do it again. So we're going to jump over to APS-C size, commonly Super 35, and you're probably going to get, a shallow depth of field or something like that. Okay, so it's a little bit less, right? And then finally, as I switch it over to the Micro Four Thirds camera, this is the struggle I have as with the camera itself, with the actual Blackmagic Pocket 4K. I'm always trying to get that f-stop really low because I want to get a very large open aperture, which allows me for more shallower depth of field for that very cinematic reality where things are out of focus. And in this case, we're exaggerating here. This is not camera accurate, but I'll bring the size down even more. And this is the fight with your iPhones, with your GH5s, is that struggle to get that shallower depth of field that you want to isolate your characters while they're giving an emotional performance. The ways you can do that, obviously, is getting f-stops as low as like 0.95 or whatever, getting these crazy lenses. Again, you can get more depth of field in this case. But I would like to bring to your attention just a link. So I have it at the bottom. Very important read if you're just a compositor or a filmmaker. Again, this talks about Filmmaker's Guide to Sensor Size and Formats. This is important to understand. I've actually was able to work with some of these cameras, their footage at least, to kind of understand it, and also dispelling some myths in here. This is a nice little picture here that kind of goes over the different sensor sizes to get an idea. I remember when I first was playing around with the Blackmagic 2.5K, this was the sensor size. Again, the bigger the sensor size, the shallower depth of field, the more intense the fall off. Okay, the smaller the sensor size, you're starting to move more towards your little iPhone, and you're going to get everything in focus. Okay, so you can see the differences here, and you can see over time different brands have got forth bigger formats because we got film directors that want to have that, again, creamy, dreamy, out of focus, blurry look in the background. So you'll have things like Arri Alexa. Again, 65, which you see all these big blockbuster movies being shot on. And then you have the Red Monstro trying to compete with Arri, and the Red Weapon, which is bigger and bigger. Red, actually, when it first started out, was a very small sensor size. That's why people were like, hey, get it bigger. So Red has been working very hard to get that sensor size way up. And you can see it still has this 35 millimeter, super 35 millimeter range here. These medium size, also known in the DSLR world as APS-C. So you're talking about usually a round number of like 23, 24, again, for the horizontal. You can see vertical as well. So you can kind of see just this sort of layout here. All right, so you can just see it go through here in different types of formats. A couple things it talks about is field of view. Like I said before, just because you change the crop factor or the sensor size, it's changing the cropping. It's changing the field of view or the narrow field of view that you see. And again, as your sensor size gets smaller, you're cropping in, but you're not changing the characteristics and the deformations or of the actual lens itself. The lens stays the same. You're just cropping in. So here's a perfect example: sensor size changing your field of view. Her face is not distorting differently from, say, if you had a wide-angle lens, she would have that Terry Gilliam sort of like large nose look. It's not changing at all, as you can see here. What is probably changing is the fact that from this sensor size to this sensor size, you're probably getting more shallower depth of field, meaning in this, in the full frame, you're going to get more shallower depth of field here. These bokehs might be actually larger versus over here. This is very comparable, though. You can see it looks very similar. And I have a feeling someone just took a picture and probably just zoomed in and cut it in. They didn't actually change up two different lenses. Maybe they did. I don't know. But again, the bigger your sensor size is, the more shallower, more blurrier the background will be because the fall off and intensity is different. Okay. So the crop factor has a really good explanation of crop factor here. It talks about the crop factor, commonly the 1.5 crop factor when you talk about APS-C or 35. You can see that crop factor difference here. It's not as pronounced from the full frame. I used to shoot with a 5D Mark II, and it was always, despite the fact it was like, oh, it looks so beautiful, all those out of focus areas, it looks like an art house film. You'd always be sitting there going, oh gosh, it's so hard to focus this person, even as you're trying to foul focus them if you're walking with them. So another thing you got to also keep in mind, this is something that's not talked about at all, is image circle. Usually your camera, when you put it through the lens and so forth, it has a diameter here of the actual circle. The diameter in millimeters is the circle, okay, from here to here. That's what's getting brought forth towards your sensor. And then it's your part to make sure that the sensor actually can fit millimeter-wise into this area. The first, even on a full-frame camera, the image that your camera's capturing, you're still technically cropping stuff that the camera can see. So that's what we have to crop it to, obviously, our viewing square or circle or rectangle, our rectangle or square, and that's what gets cropped. So again, it's important that if your sensor size has to be pretty much a little small, the sensors, the actual diameter of your image circle, okay, has to be a lot larger, right, than the actual, height or width, I should say, of your actual sensor, or the sensor, the square itself, but really the width and the height, really just the width. So it's important to understand. So they talk about that here in respects to the fact that this is a great example. For instance, in order for a lens covering the entire sensor of a full-frame camera, like a Sony 5D, it would need an image circle with a diameter of 43 millimeters. Okay, so from here to here, it's 43 millimeters, but the sensor size of a Canon 5D, okay, and if we want to know what a Canon 5D sensor size is, you can always load up your camera tracker node, and you can very easily come over here and just choose like Canon, DSLR, you could do 5D, Mark II video, or whatever, and you can see it's 35.8. So that number is smaller than 45, but that 45 is needed to encompass a sensor that is 35 by 20. So very, very, very important to understand that, to the very least, and that's where we're coming to why you need to understand that. Is because if you're not already been using cameras, you know that specific lenses are built for specific sensors. So you got full frame APS-C and micro four thirds lenses. Those lenses are specifically there for the coverage. The other myth you want to dispel is Ks. Ks has, when someone says, oh, I want to have 4K, 2K, 4K, that has to do with the photosites or whatever, the resolution, the sharpness. Has nothing to do with affecting shallow depth of field, nothing at all. So just be aware of that. So it doesn't matter. There can be a 2K Blackmagic, and here it's not going to change the only thing that's going to matter is going to be, obviously, what I was talking about earlier, but not a actual resolution. It has nothing to do with it. So again, the 50 is a 50 is a 50. The lens does not change from full frame to Super 35 to 16. She doesn't distort or change or look different. It is okay for you as a filmmaker when you go on set and your director says, I'm working on a, Blackmagic Pocket 4K. That's a 2x crop factor, okay, which would be somewhere in this range. Okay, so if I want to have a 50 millimeter look for her, a look is probably a better word to use, then I want to definitely shoot with, say, a 25 millimeter lens. That'll give me something that will look like a 50 in regards to the field of view. But the actual look of the lens, the kind of like distortion doesn't change. But as an image, as you move more and more towards the center of an image, no matter what millimeter lens it is, you start to get less and less and less distortion, okay? If she was on the edge of the frame, she would have some very, very heavy distortion. Okay, that's why you don't usually, that's the tricky part of all of this is, you don't want to have characters on the edges of your frame and then you crop in on them. But the crop always moves towards the center anyway, so you're never over here unless you, synthetically try to move over here. So anyway, That's a lot to kind of swallow, but you can see they kind of talk about it, and then they kind of give you just some background information here. And you can see here, this is a perfect example where they talk about, you know, these lenses that are covered 16, Super 35, and full frame. You can see they, you know, that these are specific lenses. Nothing's changing except the actual format of the lens. Okay, so the lens was built for Super 16, for Super 35, for full frame, and then you can see they're all the same millimeter. So again, you're gonna, it depends on what lenses you are using and what capturing, you know, reality you're dealing with, but you will find this will add to the confusion too, because you're like, what? So we haven't even talked about anamorphic yet. That's a whole nother can of worms to go into, but this is a good read. I highly recommend that you check it out. And again, you can see same field of view, different formats, focal lengths. You can see that as we kind of go through this, as the sensor size increases in size, despite the fact that we're choosing different millimeter lenses, okay, to try to equate to the same field of view, you're getting shallower depth of field as you move down here. This looks more cinematic. This would be my Blackmagic Pocket 4K, not so cinematic with the shallow depth of field, looking more like a documentary, you know, where everything's in focus, or an iPhone. But then again, this is the most common format people in Hollywood use and have used in the past with film, Super 35 millimeter, based on the actual millimeter of the actual you know, the sizes of the lenses and so forth, and the capturing film, you know, sprocket hole square itself that's actually on the film plane itself. So the film sizes mattered back in the day too. Again, all of that having to do with changing the depth of field here. So and again, you can see why filmmakers love this, why Tarantino likes the large formats, is because he's getting, unless he's using this, I don't know, I'm not super Tarantino expert, but you know, getting the option to get these beautiful shallow depth of field areas in focus, not a focus. So again, just a good conclusion here. And again, just to reiterate, I'll just go ahead and jump in and take a look through a camera here. So I'm going to go back to my first camera here, and I just want you to see, I'll just jump over to scanline render so I get faster feedback, that if I take this full frame here and I start playing around with the horizontal aperture, I don't have to really worry about the vertical aperture updating, but the horizontal aperture, you can see this is all it's doing. It's simply just cropping in on the image. The actual distortion of the edges do not change. So I'll just put that back to where it was. So just, again, that's really all you need to go. And before we leave, let's kind of just go over a you know, sensor size changes the field of view, not the millimeter lens. If you want to tick off a cinematography teacher, as I did once, start talking about like, oh, it's a 50, it makes 100, you know, 50 millimeter to 100 millimeter with the sensor crop. No, they will yell at you. It's the field of view that's changing. It's just the cropping in. A 50 millimeter lens is a 50 millimeter lens is a 50 millimeter lens. That helps instill in your mind that that's the truth. A lens image circle is measured, oops, typo, is the diameter of the circle in millimeters. Okay. Circle must be able to cover the rectangle square sensor size. So that's image circle that's coming from the camera has to cover it. Otherwise, you're going to get, you know, areas or you know, vignette and all that. Ks, 6K, you know, 4K, 6K, 8K has nothing to do with depth of field. When choosing a camera, you need the lens design for what part of the sensor you're utilizing. A lot of people can use different things like Metabone speed boosters and so forth to turn a full frame lens into something that will project onto the small sensor size, and that's a whole nother, you know, can of worms I don't want to get into. But again, if you're working on a production for VFX where they're like, look, we used a Metabone speed booster, which basically squeezed a very large image frame into a smaller area, like magnifying lens in reverse. It kind of like brought it down. You really should judge everything according to what that full frame, the measurements of the full frame was, as opposed to the crop factor, because the crop factor technically is changing. You're getting a different crop factor. lots of different variables to play a part as we move forward in developing the depth of field, the way the bokeh shapes are, the way the lens flares occur, especially when we get into the crazy lens flares of things like, you know, anamorphic lenses and so forth. So again, we're going to get into all that a little bit later. I hope this helps. And again, in the next lesson, we should be jumping into officially messing around with the depth of field tools.